So today's workshop is preparing augmentative alternative communication, otherwise known as AAC, preparing AAC users for transition, tips and tools. And I'm really grateful and appreciative to have the opportunity to introduce you to Ashley Couture, who is a speech-language pathologist with True Voice and a communication consultant with the Vermont Interdisciplinary, or I team. Ashley has been working in the field of speech-language pathology in Vermont for over 25 years, and she specializes in the use of AAC across the lifespan. And joining her today is Teresa Soares. Teresa is the parent of a young adult with a motor disability who has been employed supporting parents of young children with and without disabilities for over 20 years. Teresa is mom to two young adults who were born prematurely 25 years ago. Her son, Joe, was diagnosed with cerebral palsy at 5 months and has been connected to disability services ever since. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to Teresa and Ashley. I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Krista. So grateful to be here. And I am pulling off a technological wonder here. So give me just 1 minute. And I hope that means you can see my slides.
You got it.
Great. Excellent. So thanks again for your interest in this topic. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to share some information and hope there'll be some good questions and conversation. Hope at least there's a wide range of folks here with a wide range of knowledge and interest. So hopefully there will be some new and helpful information for some of you and for all of you in some parts of this. In terms of what we hope to accomplish and provide you with today, I'm going to offer my perspective on augmentative alternative communication, or AAC, from the speech pathology perspective, and talk about what that all encompasses and what I hope speech pathologists are keeping in mind for transition and students, and hoping to empower folks with some information that they can use as part of their advocacy toolbox in terms of advocating for kids using AAC and who are getting close to transition. I have some tools, some suggestions of some things that I hope folks will consider implementing as to help this process. And I want to share a little bit about kind of community access to services and access to AAC support services, as well as some of the funding considerations that travel along with using AAC. And then very honored to be here with Teresa, and she plans on sharing her personal perspective of living through the journey with her son, Joe. And then, as Krista said, we're hoping to time ourselves well and answer questions. So I just want to create a shared understanding of what all is in my mind when I say AAC. This is a wide range of communication support tools that range from sign language or body-based gestural communication to no technology devices such as plexiglass eye gaze board, dry erase boards, picture-based tools, but then does span all the way to high-tech devices that have become much more commercially available, much more ubiquitous in our society, that have lots of different voice output and communication options. And I'm really thinking about all of those different sorts of tools when I describe AAC. And so, what is the role of a speech-language pathologist for transition? We know that we are in a time where schools are under a ton of pressure. They're trying to do more with a lot less. Staffing is a huge issue. So realizing that the role of the speech pathologist has become more difficult, and that often other professionals are sharing jobs, or families or support people are in the role of needing to advocate for services and needs for their student. But so in an ideal world, here is what we would hope that a speech language pathologist is able to offer in regards to transition. And so first of all, it's our role to do assessment, full assessment of an individual's communication, their abilities, and their needs, and then match them with additional alternative tools to supplement their own natural communication abilities and augment what they have, but provide them with alternatives for what they need. And that assessment and teaching is ongoing and evolutionary. So we all change and evolve and grow older, and our communication changes. And so assessment needs to be a kind of ongoing process through school and then through adulthood. And the speech pathologist, hopefully you're able to find somebody that has the ability to kind of work with folks in different times in their life and is available for assessment throughout. It's the speech pathologist's role to focus and model and teach students as they're developing language and developing proficiency with using alternative communication tools to be able to understand the language about growing older and transition and adulthood, and making sure that their tools have the vocabulary on them that we're able to use to engage with them about these conversations. And that includes things like their likes and dislikes and their favorite activities, and gives them opportunity with the teachers and adults in their lives to problem solve and reflect on their development and their learning, as well as get more specific about their actual goals for their quote adulthood, right? So in general, my soapbox about this is that we should be having these conversations way earlier, and even as and then the other soapbox is that we should be having these conversations with students using AAC the same way that we're having these conversations with students not using AAC. So if I think about my kids who were verbal kiddos, but they in their, kind of middle school, early middle school years, they were doing their own goals and reflecting and leading their own conferences, right? About what were their goals, their learning goals for the year, and how are they doing and reflecting on those goals. And I think the speech pathologist plays a key role in making sure that a student using AAC has access to that vocabulary and has practice and talking to those same kinds of reflective points. It is our job as speech pathologists to ensure that users of AAC get enough practice and enough communication opportunities that they become competent with their AAC. And that usually includes 4 different areas of competence. There's linguistic competence, which is the language use on a system. There's operational competence, which means do they know how to use the technology that is their communication. There's social competence. So using this alternative method, have we given them plenty of time to practice social interactions and all the nuances that those entail? And then strategic is really where that problem solving piece comes in. So being strategic about if someone didn't give you enough time to formulate your message with your device, what are you going to do about that? So how are you going to, or if there's a breakdown in the flow of communication because somebody misunderstood what you were saying with your device, what are you going to do to solve that? So it's our job to give enough practice to ensure competence. And then another really key is to make sure we are taking time in our day to train. And that, again, is across the lifespan. So that is training all of the parts of a school team. It's training the support people in that student's life. So that care partners and family members. And as they transition, it is training the next set of community providers and folks that they will be interacting with in their life as a young adult. So again, when I think about AAC and I think about a transitioning student, I'm thinking that they could be using more than one form of AAC. So they could be using some body-based communication, they could be using high tech, and they could be using some no tech paper-based situations, right? Because we are multimodal communicators. And so people using alternative methods are multimodal as well. And another way of thinking about that is thinking about communication as a whole package, that a communicator is probably using some gestures and body based. They may be able to just use photos on a device to share about a recent trip, and that could be a very accessible and easily available technology. They might have their own communication board, either paper based or electronic, with their own specific language and symbols. Or it could be typing in a keyboard. And that when we're talking about a particular transitioning student, we're really thinking about all the different forms of communication that they use and describing all of those. So, just to lay the foundation of um, what happens after people go over the cliff of graduating from high school, which Teresa will be able to describe in much more personal detail. But once this transition has occurred, and hopefully some of this understanding and knowledge is happening before the actual transition happens. But what does community access to communication support kind of look like? And this may not include everything, and that would be wonderful if people have think of things that I have not included. But in general, we really go from this educational model of providing support services to, unfortunately, more of a medical model, but it is within the community. So the more medically based places and access to services is through a home health organization or an outpatient hospital or clinic. They often have therapists like speech language pathologists who can provide support services. The challenge there is that most of those organizations have a very narrow scope of what their area of service is. So for home health, they're really focused on maximizing independence and safety at home, and then they're out. So it's not a lot of ongoing community integration type of support. And in an outpatient hospital or clinic, they are also working kind of in the most stringent sense of a medical model, in that it's really based on medical necessity and short-term need, and there are goals. And once those goals are met based on that medical need, then they're done. Um, and it also is very dependent on insurance coverage. So sometimes some of the access to services is defined by what's available through somebody's insurance. So that can also be a restriction to access of services. There are private practice clinicians, as some of you may have experience with. We're in a significant speech pathology shortage in this state. It may not be just Vermont, it may be nationwide. I think it is nationwide, actually. But particularly in Vermont, where we're a small number of folks spread out, it's really hard to get access to private practice services. And it's hard for private practice clinicians to be specialists in AAC. That's kind of there's a lot of time with AAC that is hard to capture from a financial reimbursement perspective. And so it's often a challenge for folks to do that. But there are private practice folks out there. One of the things that's been a nice model for me is that I started doing private practice after leaving UVM Medical Center and was able to form some relationships with designated community service agencies. So those are regional designated agencies such as Howard Center, Washington County Mental Health, Upper Valley Services. They are regionally based agencies that support individuals with developmental disabilities, and as well as many others. And those individuals may have communication needs. And I've been able to form, through my private practice, contractual relationships with those agencies so that I can provide consultative services and train folks there in hopes of supporting communication needs for those individuals on a more ongoing basis. So it's still not enough, but it's a model that seems to be gaining some traction and seems to be working fairly well with the agencies that I've been able to develop that relationship with. One of the reasons why that's such a benefit and why you need a speech pathologist is because of the way that technology is tied to funding. So when we're talking about technology, there are medical insurance avenues for getting funding for speech generating technology, but they do require an evaluation from a speech language pathologist. And that's why the lack of access to speech pathologists is so challenging because it really does limit people's access to the technology that they need. Um, there's a couple of different avenues for technology. iPads have become very ubiquitous, and there are definitely communication apps on iPads that are available to help. The tricky part is the other reason the speech pathologist is helpful is because it's great to have that input on matching the best technology with the person's communication needs. So, unfortunately, the more expensive options, which are these very clear, dedicated speech generating devices, um, are funded by insurance but require this evaluation by a speech pathologist in order to document the necessity. And it's many, they're hoops, a lot of insurance hoops that are we have to jump through in order to get the funding. But it is doable, and we work very hard at it for the people that need it. And there are some alternative funding sources. There are some need-based grants, and then vocational rehabilitation or high ability is another avenue for some supports for technology that is needed for someone to pursue work-related goals, which communication is a big part. So, a couple of tools that I have found helpful and that I would recommend is that people begin when students are in school and begin as early as possible is to begin a living document that's called a communication dictionary. And what a communication dictionary is a catalog of all the different ways that a person communicates. That can be gestural, body-based communication. It can be facial expressions. It can be voice. It can be with a device. Whatever mode of communication the person uses. And what we think it means, because we don't presume that we can always know for sure what the person is meaning by that type of communication, and how we should respond. And it is intended to be a resource for people to learn the person's communication and avoid the situations that often develop where the folks that know the person best start saying, well, I know what they mean. And I can always interpret what they're, because it makes the person very dependent on those familiar people for interpreting their messages. And a communication dictionary is meant to be an educational tool to help less familiar communication partners get to know an individual's communication. It's very much meant to be a living document, an evolving document as a student gets older, but it could be a critical tool for that transition between high school and the community to really have a good catalog of a person's communication modes and modalities. Another example is a communication passport. And that is something that's really meant to engage the student in development of what they want others to know about them. And it's an opportunity to talk about what the student wants people to know about their communication and how they communicate best as a way of advocating for their communication preferences and their communication needs. And so it's another tool that could be developed with the student that would go with them during transition as a way of providing important information to the next set of providers and community folks. There is a lot of information about transition, and hopefully this presentation on AAC will kind of go into that bank of resources. And Vermont Family Network is an amazing resource for information on transition. And the state also has a lot of resources. So I just wanted to make folks aware of that. I'm next is to hand it over to Teresa, and I'm doing well, but I had one thing that I thought of that I don't want to forget. So give me just 1 second to see if I can think of what it was. Oh, and Teresa's going to talk more about this, but I wanted to share one other tool that I thought was particularly effective in helping with transition. And that is particularly for students using high-tech AAC, um, creating videos and resources to share in a format like a Google Drive or in a Google Slides presentation could be a very effective way of passing on information. So taking videos about how the student uses their device, taking literal how-to videos of how the programming happens, how the student is involved in programming specific things on their device, um, and putting those into passwords, all the passwords and account information that go along with the student's device and language on the device. Compiling all of those into a shareable format like a Google Drive can be an incredibly effective way of sharing information. So I can't tell you how helpful it was with Teresa's son Joe in particular to have that as a resource. We've gone back to it multiple times to kind of remind ourselves about technology and resources for the technology. And so it's been a really helpful resource. So that was another suggestion of a tool to support transition. So I'm going to pass it over to Teresa to share an awesome story, fun story.
Thank you, Ashley. So I wanted to share a picture of Joe just for a little perspective because this is really his story and I'm just sort of narrating it for him. I do want to just acknowledge that my story is just my story and every family kind of navigates supports and services and transitions for their children differently. Um, in some ways, I had access to some really awesome supports based on where I live, and I know that in more remote parts of the state, it's not as easy and cohesive to be able to do that. So I just want to acknowledge that. But my bio described a little bit about a premature birth and being diagnosed with cerebral palsy. Joe's cerebral palsy is the type that affects all four of his limbs, his vision, and his ability to talk with his voice. So we were right out of the hospital, connected to early intervention supports and have been in, the special needs world ever since. All of Joe's needs are unique and they overlap and they make things complicated in terms of making decisions because he needs to have proper seating in his wheelchair so that he can access his switches. He needs to, have his other medical needs kind of managed so that he can stay as comfortable as possible. So everything kind of overlaps, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And what I learned very early on was that Joe's diagnosis was very low incidence. It was very difficult for us to find peers in our community that had needs similar to Joe. So we did find a very small group of individuals in our community, which I felt really thankful for. And it was kind of that parent connection and peers for Joe that kind of helped us in our path as well. But I did realize very early that we had a very steep learning curve. Next slide. So in the beginning, I like to think about transition as like our whole life has been a series of transitions. So I had to learn an awful lot. And in the beginning, it felt like stages of grief. And I'm sure other parents on this can probably relate to that. At first, it was a lot of worry and fear. We had to do a lot of learning about how I started thinking like really deeply and kind of got in a little funk myself about how's he going to be able to make friends? He doesn't have a voice. How's he going to be able to tell us what he's thinking about? How will others react to him not speaking? Just so many scary things. And I felt a little alone in the beginning. But then once I found that parent group, it kind of helped me feel less isolated. Um, I definitely relied on our early intervention home visit team, and we had dozens and dozens of appointments every month. And I relied on them as the experts because I was completely novice in all of this navigation. I asked so many questions, they probably knew they were going to have to spend almost half the visit just responding to what my questions were. Um, but in working with them, I started to realize that it's a little bit of trial and error. We have to find where the strengths are and then build from there. So that worry and fear started to transition into coping and then into hopefulness. And, having some positive role models on what's possible really helped me to kind of transition my parenting and my worry about my son into like, okay, we've got to learn some stuff and this is what we're going to do. So I put myself in education mode. I needed to be present. I needed to pick the brains of anyone that was working with Joe. I needed to learn about what AAC was and how to do that. So I immersed myself in going to conferences and trainings. I wanted to shadow people, um, access those other parents, and just realizing that it was going to take a community and not just an individual to kind of get through this process, and be able to support my son in the best way that I could. So again, like I said, starting from strengths, we had to like figure out what our priorities were. And that took a little while to figure out because everything felt important, his motor skills and the management of his muscles that were too tight, was a big focus in the early years. And then when we got into school age things and we're writing IEPs, the IEPs were just getting so big and unmanageable. So we had to start thinking about where we wanted to prioritize. And in the back of my mind, it was always there. Like the motor stuff is really important, but he's always going to be needing motor support. And so let's focus on his language and communication because he needs to be able to navigate and kind of direct other people around him. So for him to have a voice and a way to express himself seemed to me like if we had to pick one area to focus on, that's where we went. Um, and Joe was showing us all along that he was understanding really well. He was showing us that he loved going to school, that he definitely was an active learner, and he was motivated to try to figure out how to use these complex systems. Um, and I found that in the school setting, I really needed to partner with those providers that were there, um, acknowledging how much work they were doing, showing appreciation to the team, kind of help build those relationships. Um, I relied on them a lot because they were with him during the day and I wasn't once he was in school. So, it made me anxious to not have those direct in-person interactions to learn along with Joe. But we as a team decided to do monthly IEP check-in meetings. And then we also had a lot of communication, a daily summary, handwritten would go back and forth, and email and just staying in really good communication. I would send notes in the morning, like, I think Joe's upset today. These are some things that it could be. He slept good. He didn't sleep good. He ate a good breakfast. All the things that could affect how he is navigating his day. And then they would send me notes about this is what Joe worked on at school today. These are the things that we tried. These are the things that he seemed interested in. And so there was some back and forth information. So I felt like I could ask Joe questions about his day and have it be meaningful. And then, I always wanted to maintain an active presence in all the decision making and planning activities. So that was, again, just part of that partnership and part of that me realizing that I was the constant in Joe's life and all these professionals had Joe's best interest, but they were going to move on and there was going to be a series of transitions that I kind of needed to be the keeper of the information. Next slide. So planning for best outcomes. Yeah, I didn't put this on the slide, and I'm just going to mention it, and maybe we can include a link somewhere. But I was introduced to a documentary called Including Samuel, and maybe some of you have heard of it. That really opened my eyes to the possibilities of inclusion, um, and what Cheryl Jorgensen from University of New Hampshire calls least dangerous assumption, and presuming competence. And so that was sort of a catalyst for like, okay, we're going to do this. Joe's capable. We got to make sure everyone's on board with this. So collaboration had to be first and foremost. Everybody needed to work together towards what the goals were for Joe. And that included Joe's pediatrician, all the specialists on our team. We had support in the school from the I-Team services. And so they were kind of guiding the school team on best practices and kind of, narrowing down goals. Paras were really important, peers, caregivers. We somehow were able to navigate getting the right people in place. What I learned early on was I needed to think about what made Joe successful. And then I would, in the IP process, say, these are the things that I know about Joe that help him be the most successful. So I need people around him that have these skills. So I wasn't asking for a certain person. I was asking for a set of skills, and somehow, a little bit of bumps, but mostly things came together, and those kind of skills were part of the team that was around Joe. Um, we found it really important to have a strength-based mindset from everyone on the team. Things were really difficult to figure out, but we all had to have kind of like, okay, that didn't work. We're going to move on to the next thing. A lot of trial and error, a lot of, okay, this little piece of this worked, but we're going to try it differently and see how that goes. So it was never a one straight path. It was always a little tweaks and turns along the way. And then I started thinking about big picture thinking, I call. How do all these different specialists with their silos come together to make Joe as successful as he can be? So again, going back to, does he have the right seating? Does he have the right access for his switch? Does he have, enough emotional support that we're kind of helping him through his worries that he's having? All kinds of things. So it's multifaceted. So the speech and language piece, huge, but it can't be successful unless everything else is in place too. We trialed all kinds of access for Joe with his communication. He uses one of those more sophisticated speech generation devices, and we found that his most reliable way to access that was through a switch at his head with an auditory scanning feature in the background. So a really complex way to access the device and navigating it, but the most successful for Joe. And unfortunately, it turns out it's the slowest access method, and you need a lot of patience with that. And so trying to teach people around Joe to give him time to scan, to choose, to say what he's got to say, we needed to make sure that his communication partners were giving him that time and space to do that, giving him just enough support, but not too much. Also a delicate balance. Like I said, he showed lots of good understanding. I talked about the I-Team already. We talked about making the communication his primary focus. And then we were, as we moved along, kind of making goals that were providing practical use for life after school. So his math goals turned from learning all the multiplication division to like, how does he use a calendar? How can he use the clock? How can he use a schedule? So we weren't always so pushing on all the academic learning. He really loved the other areas that were more language focused. So he loved his literature classes. And we used his device to kind of pre-program some messages. He took tests in a multiple choice format. And he ended up kind of blowing away some of his teachers who, to be honest, probably underestimated his ability. And then he had some like really profound things to say about the literature group. So again, presume competence, don't underestimate. Um, he is really successful using some special features on his device, like the feelings page has been eye-opening for us and has really helped kind of let Joe express himself. He loves the calendar. He likes to know what's coming up, and he has been able to use some email, and Ashley can attest that sometimes his emails are rather comical, and not always cohesive, but he's doing it independently, so we love that. um, I continue to just advocate about Joe's strengths in this whole process. And then in high school in particular, but really all through grade school and especially in middle school, we just had people around us on Joe's team that really believed in him and really believed that there was potential there and would not give Joe the easy way out, and would just make him work just that little bit more to kind of stretch his capacity for use of his device. Next slide. So in terms of specific transition planning, um, I had to kind of go through a mindset shift for myself. Instead of doing for Joe, I had to shift it to doing things with him. And that was a way to empower Joe to kind of share what he thought he needed for himself. We made sure he was always present in meetings that were about him and his future, because he definitely wants to know what was going on and he has opinions. So he would share those with us. Um, in a transition process from middle school to high school, we used a system called MAPS, which is Making Action Plans. It's a person-centered planning tool. And we use that. It was so helpful because it was all about what Joe thought for himself around his dreams, his interests, his needs, and then also as parents, what was our perspective for his brother to kind of have input there, and then the whole team that worked with him in middle school, and then the receiving team in the high school could kind of learn so much about Joe from that process, in addition to all the sharing of the IEP goals and progress and academic work that he was doing. So I really liked that process. And we had a room full of people when we did that process, and we were there for a couple of hours at least. There's so much to talk about. And we also, as a team, in the high school years, had a shared Google Doc that we used for communication instead of the handwritten ones that we did earlier in grade school. And so that kind of streamlined the process for everyone. So we were electronic and moving into the the new realm of online work. And Ashley mentioned the how-to videos that our team worked really hard to put together a whole series of how to do the setup, how to help Joe kind of find where he's looking to go without over cueing him, but giving him the just right amount of support. What to do for all the technical things with the device, how to program it, how to um, switch from using it on the earbuds to having it out loud so everyone could hear, just everything. In the background, in addition to doing all this work around transition, we were still navigating all of Joe's other needs, which I haven't talked a lot about, but we were seeing a PT in the community, and she just happened to mention to me at one of our sessions focused on his motor needs that, oh, Joe's getting close to transition age. I've heard from SLPs that they really wish they had a chance for overlap, so that they don't have to start from scratch. And it just aha moment for me, like, okay, yes, we need to transition these services. What does that look like? And so our school speech and language pathologist had also planted a seed for me that it would be important for Joe to have access to an SLP with their Cs to kind of keep up the maintenance and reorders and assessments and things like that. So we kind of put those thoughts together, and I went to our team and said, okay, I think we need to figure out how to do this. And I think I've heard of someone from the community that might be working with adults, so I'm going to reach out to her and see how can we make this work. So again, just as a perfect storm of coincidence, access, which I know isn't available everywhere. Um, but and we were also having overlap time with the designated agency while Joe was in extended school years after his 4 years of high school, he was able to stay on longer. So we focused those extra years of high school to kind of work on transition. Um, and the designated agency person, I asked about how we can get some payment for Ashley to
Mm.
overlap with the school SLP. And it wasn't easy. I don't really remember exactly how it all worked out. But we were able to have a couple, 2, 3 sessions of overlap and information sharing, just one-on-one, um, professional to professional. And I think that really helped give the provider perspective to the receiving providers so that that was a more seamless transition. Um,
Just so people
I would
know,
all,
the Cs are the
yeah.
certificate of clinical competence, and that's a certification for speech pathologists that's important for being able to recommend devices. Um, and I just want to also say that this designated agency happens to be an agency that puts a ton of focus on communication and has communication support folks in designated roles to do that. And so it was a less hard sell to have them do some overlap and have them but the agency actually did pay to have that overlap, which was awesome.
And I just want to say from a parent perspective, like this whole process of this big transition was bumpy. It wasn't seamless and easy. I had a lot of sleepless nights. I worried about the cliff. I've heard about that in many circumstances, so I knew it was going to feel very different once we were out of school. Um, And I sort of was worried about losing our safety net with having the supports that we were going to need for Joe for his communication. Um, Next slide. And I'll go quickly through this one. Next slide.
I think we're at the next
There it
slide.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. So right now, Joe's been out of high school for a couple of years. He uses his communication device in the community. He has a small job at UVM in their fitness center. And so he's greeting people that come in using pre-programmed um, messages that are on his talker. And he is becoming quicker and faster and really adept at that. So he's really loving that. Um, at home, he's still learning with his device. He's having lots of access to it and just exploring the keyboard and word prediction and finding all these fun, fancy words that he can say now. And exploring through pre-programmed pages. He's um, starting to be more conversational with his device. Context is more appropriate now. Um, Let's see. He's using his device now to initiate conversation, which had been a goal for a long time in his IEP. And it was really, he was just seeing his device as a way to respond in those earlier years. But now he's like, oh, I have my voice. I can express myself and start a conversation. So that's a huge change for Joe. Um, he's creating more complex messages and now with a little more accurate sentence structure. Sometimes you have to be an investigator and think about the context. He might just list a few nouns and maybe a verb, and you have to try to figure out what's the cohesive thing that he's trying to say. So again, the importance of that communication partner who can kind of decipher what he's communicating. Um, he goes to a Howard Center sponsored communication group with his peers that are also using communication devices. He does that a couple times a month, and I think that that really just helps him normalize the use of his device. Um, he likes to talk about how he has navigated his world in disability services, and he has done a couple presentations. Um, and then we are having regular planning time with the communication partner from Howard Center with Ashley's support in the background to kind of keep the device current and working out any little bumps and corrections that need to be made. Um, and he also still gets really anxious when he feels on the spot to make a message. So, we're kind of working through that and letting Joe kind of tell us what he needs in those kind of settings. So when we do presentations together and he has given input into the slides and messages that he wants to say, he'll often ask a communication partner to just hit the button for him because he gets stressed and then it's hard for him to access his switch and feel like he's doing it fast enough. And that makes him anxious still. But all in all, he's still growing with the device, which I'm so thankful for. Um, and I feel like we are kind of in a pretty good place right now. So that's what I would share.
Thank you so much to both of you. I really appreciate this conversation and the perspective that first that you shared, Ashley, with some practical tools and suggestions, and then Teresa sharing Joe's story and just really personalizing that, recognizing that it is one story, but there were so many takeaways that I think lots of folks can apply as they're thinking about transition for AAC users. So thank you both. Um, we're going to take a few minutes for questions or comments that folks might have, but we would love to just take a moment to ask you to fill out an evaluation that is part of our grant requirements. And so the link to that should be in the chat. I believe that. Um,
Looks like it is.
yep, it's just put in there. So I'm going to give you all a slightly awkward 1 minute moment in your awkwardness, you'll be forced to complete the evaluation. So we'll pick up with questions in just a minute.
It should be like a feedback song.
Do
We love
you
feedback.
do
We
do
need feedback.
do. Okay. So I'd love to open it up for thoughts or comments that folks want to share with Ashley or Teresa. We're a small group, so if you want to just unmute, go ahead. Otherwise, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand, whatever you're comfortable with.
I wanted to also say, I kind of edited it just for time's sake, but one of the big things that kind of helped me through transition process was VFN sponsored trainings and information sharing about transition. So if you have families that are feeling like they need a little extra support, lean into VFN for that kind of support as well.
Thank you for that.
My camera on. I'm a school-based SLP. Hi, Ashley.
Hi, Monica. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Um, Teresa, what is something that you would want the school-based SLP to know as we prepare for transitioning?
Oh boy, that's a big question. Um, just, I mean, really just having like a cohesive, like to go package to go with us. I think that was just critical. Um, I really um, put a lot of faith into our SLP. We had a provider that just really knew Joe so well. And, I knew Joe from home, but she knew all the ins and outs of kind of how he was navigating and what he was still focused on learning and how he was, engaging with it. So having that level of information to take with us for whoever comes down the pipe, was just, I kind of think that was the most important thing for us. So we could use that to train new caregivers at home with Joe. We could use that for community providers. We could use that even for family members who wanted to kind of support Joe. So I think that's just the biggest thing. And it takes time. And so we started that process really early. It wasn't just an overnight thing. It was months of planning and
I was going to ask
organizing.
what was early? Was early months or was early like a couple years or like I was curious.
Yeah. I'm I think we were using the document at first, but then we realized that videos were a little
Mhm,
more helpful having the visual to go with it.
mhm. Yeah. And if I could just add to that just a little bit, this is an unusually good situation, right? Because the high school speech pathologist was an AAC expert. She has come
Mhm.
from AAC training in her background, and she was technology savvy and able to take videos while she was also programming the device, which is not every speech pathologist could do that. And then I was the community provider, and I also have AAC experience, and I was like, and I also knew Joe. So this is like the ideal scenario. And I think that what she put together as the package of Google Slides, it included all the detailed information that anybody would ever need to know. Like, what is the account name? What is the password? What is the tech support number? Like, where have you run into snags? Like, how do you guys do programming and decide where things go? How do what is the name of the cord, the earbud that you've ordered that goes, for Joe to listen to his, like, so it was so much detailed information that was important to pass on. Like, no detail is too small, I guess is what I would say. Um,
And I think she had like outside SLP time on the IEP that wasn't directly with Joe, which I think also made a difference for her to
Critically
have time to
important.
do that.
I would advocate, yeah, Monica's on that. I would advocate for that with anybody that you advocate for additional time for the speech pathologist to be able to prepare like and work on technology. Yep, 100%. And then the other thing is we're really trying, no, I'm going to be quiet and let other people ask questions. Sorry.
There was a question that just came into the chat. What did the communication transition tool or document look like? Which elements were included and did include any videos?
It was, hi Marika, it's good to see your name. Um, um, the transition tool was literally a Google slide presentation. It was a Google Slides. It was a presentation. And in the presentation, she had put videos and instructions. And then the slides. So it was slides. Now it could have been Google Docs in a Google shared drive, but I think the Google Slides presentation just allowed it all to be in the same document. So it was just a slide with each of the pieces and plus the videos were right in there. So it was an easy way to kind of keep all the videos together in the same place. Are there other questions?
In the chat, again, what would be a good tool for transient staff working with the individual?
What do you mean by transient? Like people, a good tool. Can you tell me what you
Hello.
mean?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. Uh, I mean, just in the adult services world, there is a lot of changes of staff all the time. And now with the decrease in funding, it might get even worse. Um, what is a good tool to prepare for all these people that come on board and need a quick presentation and
Yeah.
how to help them be good communication partners?
Yeah, that's awesome. That actually really set up nicely for what I was going to say when I said I was going to be quiet for a second, was that we're really working really hard to advocate for agencies to think for designated agencies to think about how they meet communication needs and consider having people in at a minimum a part-time role, if not a full-time role, on communication supports. So it doesn't need to be a speech pathologist, but if it can be somebody who has demonstrated interest and passion towards supporting people who are using alternative means of communication and then are willing to go to trainings and learn. So the first strategy I would say is to advocate with agencies to see if they could have somebody who could have designated time to help support communication partner training needs or support technology needs, or so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, I think that a Google Drive or a shared document like this that includes information so most agencies have a communication plan for people, or should, sorry, let me take a step back. There is a document that are called communication plans that go along with the individual services agreement that are required to be created now by oh my gosh, I just got to sit down the rabbit hole of what is now happening in agencies. Sorry. But there is an individual service agreement for every adult who is served by a designated agency. There is something called a communication plan that is an adjunct to that individual services agreement. And the communication plan is meant to outline how the person communicates and what are their communication supports and methods and strategies that help them communicate the best they can. So the communication plan should be a tool that should be available and used to train new staff and to support consistent communication supports for that individual. Um, Individual service agreements are created by now an external organization called a case management organization, CMO. What is CMO?
Yeah.
But the communication plans are still housed within the agencies themselves. So that is something that um, the agencies still have more control over, is to develop a communication plan. And then I recommend, along with other members of the Vermont Communication Task Force, recommend a communication technology information form, which has all the specifics about a person's device. So it has the name of the device they're using, the name of the communication program, the tech support contact information, the passwords and usernames, the ordering information for external accessories like headphones and things like that. It has everything on a form that would go along with the communication plan. And those are tools. So a communication dictionary, a communication plan, and a tech form would be tools that we would use to do a training with staff.
Ashley, I think you have a stop at 2. We did have a question in the chat about how to navigate if the SLP at school is not an expert, or the SLP, I guess, could be in the community, is not an expert in AAC. Are you available to stay on to address that?
Yeah, I can. It's a
Okay.
hard question, right? It's a really hard question. I think it is to encourage that person to see if they can connect with a mentor, see if there's somebody that would be willing to mentor them even remotely, see if the school would be willing to build in some sort of supports for getting that speech pathologist some of the training and the mentorship that they might need to be able to meet that need, or um, they could consult with the Vermont interdisciplinary team if they're a student in school. The interdisciplinary team is through the University of Vermont Center for Disability and Community Inclusion, and we can provide that as a resource when we send out the email. But you can ask the school to consider referring to the Vermont I team. And And so I would just advocate for you to see if you could get external mentorship. It's a tricky conversation, right? That's a tricky conversation to have. And hopefully the SLP is at least willing to acknowledge, wait, this is not an area of expertise for me. I'm open to getting some help and doing some things in some other ways.
Thank
Any
you.
other suggestions, Monica, or anybody?
I was gonna say, advocating to the school administration to allow the SLP to have the time to take those additional trainings. Oftentimes, we are so overbooked. There is such a high level of need, and we have so many students that we get bogged down and even though we want to learn and do more, we don't always have the opportunity within the parameters of our role to do that.
Thank you. I am going to provide my contact information.
Yes, thank you. And thank you both again and for everyone in attendance. Great conversation. And as we said earlier, you'll all get an email with the recording, and Ashley's contact information, I think, will be with that. And then, just check out our website. We're often regularly offering workshops on a variety of topics, and especially related to transition. So thank you again, Teresa and Ashley, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their afternoon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.